The rope burn was still fresh on Mariah Crowley's wrists when they dragged her before the town council in the dirt square of Bitter Creek. Her belly swollen 6 months heavy with child, she stumbled on the wooden platform they'd built for judgments and hangings both, her bare feet scraping splinters from the warped planks. The August sun beat down merciless, turning the air thick as syrup, and the dust devils danced between the silent crowd like spirits come to bear witness. She was 23 years old. Her dark hair hung in matted ropes down her back, still clinging with pine needles and forest debris. Her calico dress, the blue one her dead mother had sewn, was torn at the shoulder, showing skin scraped raw and bleeding. Her hands instinctively cupped her belly, protecting what lived there, even as her own life hung by a thread, thin as spider silk. "Mariah Crowley," announced Josiah Crane, the town magistrate, a man whose belly preceded him into every room and whose breath always carried the stink of whiskey, poorly hidden. "You stand accused of unnatural congress, of witchery, of abandoning your husband's home in the night to commune with dark spirits in the forest." He paused, letting the words settle like crows on a fence post. "And of conspiring to bring curse upon this town through the child you carry." The crowd murmured. Mariah could feel their eyes on her, some curious, some afraid, most just hungry for spectacle in a life that offered little else. She recognized faces. Martha Healy, who'd shared her sourdough starter just last spring. Tom Brewster, who'd helped her late husband fix their roof before the consumption took him. Even young Sarah Potts, barely 14, whom Mariah had taught to read using her mother's old Bible. Not one of them met her eyes now. "I followed a child, crying," Mariah said, her voice cracked and dry. "That's all. I heard a baby crying in the forest, and I went to find it." "In the dead of night?" This from Reverend Michaels, whose collar was always too tight and whose sermons always ran too long. A decent Christian woman, 6 months widowed and with child, wandering the devil's woods at midnight? What manner of Christian follows strange sounds into darkness? "A mother," Mariah whispered. Crane held up a burlap sack. From it, he withdrew objects one by one. A bundle of dried sage tied with red thread. A small carved figure of cottonwood root. 3 stones painted with symbols. Old things her grandmother had kept. Remnants of knowledge from Ireland's green hills before the hunger ships. "Found in her cabin," Crane announced. "Tools of witchcraft." Elias Crowley, her dead husband's brother, stepped forward and spat at her feet. "Whore! James wasn't cold 3 months before you started showing. Whose bastard is it you carry?" The crowd's murmur grew louder. Mariah felt the platform sway beneath her feet. She hadn't eaten in 2 days. Not since they'd locked her in the root cellar. Not since they'd bound her, wrists so tight the rope had bitten through skin. "I carry my husband's child," she said. "James's son or daughter." "Liar!" Elias's face reddened. James was sick half a year, could barely rise from bed. That child's spawned from sin. It wasn't true, but truth didn't matter here. Elias wanted her land, the 40 acres James had left her. A widow with property was an inconvenience. A dead witch was an opportunity. 3 nights before they took her, Mariah had been alone in the cabin James built, the one that still smelled of his tobacco and leather, even 4 months after they'd buried him. The baby turned restless inside her, pressing against her ribs like it was trying to climb out through bone. She couldn't sleep. The August heat made the air inside thick enough to choke on, so she sat by the open window, letting the night breeze cool her swollen ankles. That's when she heard it. A child crying. Not the angry wail of a hungry infant, but something softer, more broken. The sound of a little one lost and scared, calling for someone who wouldn't come. The sound drifted through the pines, distant but clear as church bells on Sunday morning. Mariah's first thought was the Hutchinson boy, little Michael, who sometimes wandered from his family's homestead a mile east. But the Hutchinsons had moved on 2 months back, driven out by failed crops and broken promises. There were no other children living close enough for her to hear. Still, the crying continued. Thin and reedy, like wind through a hollow log, but unmistakably human. She pulled her shawl around her shoulders and lit the oil lamp. Her feet found her boots by the door, the leather still holding the shape of her swollen feet. She knew it was foolish. A pregnant woman alone, walking into darkness. But the crying pulled at something deep in her chest, something that had nothing to do with sense and everything to do with the life growing inside her. The forest swallowed her whole. Pine branches caught at her dress and hair. The lamp cast jittering shadows that made the trees seem alive, reaching. Her breath came harder as the path, what little path there was, grew steeper, winding up toward the ridge where the old growth stood, trees older than the town, older than white men's claims to this land. The crying led her deeper, always just ahead, always just out of reach. She walked for what felt like hours. Her feet ached. The baby kicked hard against her spine, protesting the journey. Sweat ran down her back, despite the cool night air. But the crying never stopped, and she couldn't turn back, couldn't abandon whatever child was lost out here in the devil's dark. Then she saw the light. Not lamplight or firelight, but something else. A pale blue glow emanating from a clearing ahead. The crying had stopped. In its place, a heavy silence pressed down like a physical weight. Mariah stepped into the clearing and froze. A circle of stones stood in the center, each one carved with symbols she recognized from her grandmother's old things. In the middle of the circle lay a deer, freshly killed, its throat cut clean. The blood was still wet, still steaming in the cool air. And standing over it, wearing a dark cloak with symbols painted in what looked like ash or mud, was a figure she couldn't quite see clearly. Before she could move, could run, could scream, rough hands grabbed her from behind. "Caught you!" Elias Crowley's voice hissed in her ear. "Caught you red-handed with your devil worship!" She tried to fight, tried to explain, but there were 3 of them. Elias, the magistrate's son, and Tom Brewster, whose betrayal cut deeper than the others. They bound her wrists with rope that bit like teeth. The cloaked figure in the clearing had vanished like smoke. They dragged her back through the forest, her protests falling on deaf ears, and by dawn the whole town knew. The widow Crowley had been caught practicing witchcraft in the woods. The sun had reached its cruel zenith when the stranger rode into Bitter Creek on a horse the color of smoke and ash. He sat his saddle like a man who'd forgotten how to do anything else, his back straight, despite the dust of 100 miles coating his clothes. His face was weathered leather, lined deep around the eyes and mouth, not from smiling, but from squinting into too many hard distances. A Confederate cavalry hat sat low on his brow, faded gray and stained with salt rings from years of sweat. He wore no gun belt, but a rifle rode in a scabbard on his saddle, and a long knife hung from his belt in a beaded sheath that spoke of Cheyenne craftsmanship. His name was Caleb Stone. though he hadn't spoken it aloud in 3 years. Not since Shiloh. Not since he'd buried what remained of his wife and daughter, after the border raiders came through Kansas. He'd been riding west with no destination, just movement to keep the memories at bay, when he'd stopped for water at a creek 5 miles back and heard 2 trappers talking about the witch trial in Bitter Creek. How they'd caught a pregnant woman doing devil's work in the forest. How they were going to hang her come sunset, baby and all, and cleanse the town of her evil. Something in Caleb's chest had tightened at that. He'd seen enough killing, enough injustice dressed up in righteous words. He'd told himself he was done interfering, done trying to fix what was broken in this world. But the image of a pregnant woman on a gallows wouldn't leave him, kept rising up behind his eyes like smoke from a fire that wouldn't die. So he'd turned his horse north toward Bitter Creek. Now he sat at the edge of the crowd, watching the scene unfold on the platform. The woman, Mariah they called her, stood with her hands bound before her, her belly round with life, even as they prepared her for death. Her face was bruised, her dress torn, but her eyes held something Caleb recognized. Not fear, but a kind of fierce determination to stay standing, to not give them the satisfaction of seeing her break. "We find you guilty," Crane was saying, his voice booming across the square. "Guilty of witchcraft, of fornication with dark spirits, of carrying a cursed child. The sentence is death by hanging, to be carried out immediately so that your evil may not spread further." A woman in the crowd, older, with gray hair pinned severe, produced a wooden sign. Painted on it in crude black letters were the words, "Witch, Devil's Whore." They hung it around Mariah's neck on a rope that matched the one binding her wrists. The wood was heavy enough that her shoulders sagged under its weight. Mariah swayed but didn't fall. Her lips moved in what might have been prayer, or might have been curses. Caleb couldn't tell from this distance. "Any last words?" Crane asked, though his tone suggested he didn't care for an answer. Mariah raised her head. Her voice came out stronger than Caleb expected. "I am innocent. God knows it, and he will judge you for this." "God's judgment is here," Reverend Michaels intoned, "and it finds you wanting." They brought out the rope, thick hemp, the noose already tied. Elias Crowley held it up like a trophy, grinning. They positioned Mariah beneath the hanging beam, slipped the noose over her head. The rough hemp scraped against her throat, already raw from 2 days of screaming her innocence into deaf ears. Caleb's hands tightened on his reins. The horse shifted beneath him, sensing his tension. He should ride on. This wasn't his town, wasn't his fight. He'd learned the hard way that playing hero only got you ghosts to keep you company at night. But his daughter would have been about this woman's age now, if she'd lived. And she'd been carrying his grandchild when the raiders killed her. The image rose unbidden. His daughter's body in the burned cabin, her hands still curved, protective around her belly. Before Caleb knew he was moving, he'd urged his horse forward through the crowd. "Hold," he said, his voice carrying that particular quality of command that came from leading men through cannon fire. The crowd parted instinctively. Heads turned. Crane looked up, annoyed at the interruption. "This is town business, stranger. Best you ride on." Caleb dismounted slowly, deliberately. He walked to the platform with the careful steps of a man who'd learned to measure violence in increments. When he reached the stairs, he stopped and looked up at Mariah. Their eyes met, and something passed between them. Recognition, maybe, of two people who'd both learned that the world could take everything and expect you to keep breathing anyway. "I said this is town business," Crane repeated, his hand moving toward the pistol at his belt. "You got no right." "I got the right of a witness," Caleb said, his voice flat and hard as iron. "I was in those woods 3 nights back. I saw what happened." A lie, but a necessary one. The crowd stirred, uncertain now. Mariah's eyes widened, confusion and desperate hope warring in her expression. "You weren't nowhere near those woods," Elias snarled, stepping forward. "I know every man in this territory, and I never seen you before." "That's the advantage of being a stranger," Caleb said. "Nobody notices when you're watching." He turned to address the crowd, pitching his voice to Carrie. "I was camped up on the ridge, couldn't sleep. I heard crying too, a child's voice. I followed it, same as she did." "And what did you see?" This from Reverend Michaels, his voice dripping skepticism. "I saw men," Caleb said. 3 of them, one wearing a cloak, playing at devil worship. I saw them wait for her, knowing she'd come, knowing a woman who'd lost her husband, who was carrying a child, couldn't ignore the sound of a baby crying." He paused, let his eyes sweep across the crowd. "I saw a trap, and I saw the same men who claimed to have caught her at witchcraft were the ones who set that trap in the first place." The silence that followed was thick enough to cut. Elias's face had gone from red to purple. "That's a goddamn lie." "Is it?" Caleb's hand moved to his knife, not drawing it, just resting there. "Then explain why the deer's blood was still warm when she arrived. Explain how she could have killed it and set up that circle when she'd only been gone from her cabin 20 minutes. I timed it. I watched her leave her door and followed her path." He was improvising now, building the lie with the confidence of a man who'd learned that certainty mattered more than truth when swaying a crowd. Explain why 3 men were waiting in the woods to grab her before she could even speak, almost like they knew she'd be there. Tom Brewster had gone pale. The magistrate's son wouldn't meet anyone's eyes. Elias looked ready to draw his gun, consequences be damned. But before anyone could speak, a small voice cut through the tension. "He's telling truth." Every head turned. Little Sarah Potts stood at the front of the crowd, her thin frame trembling but her voice steady. "I saw Mr. Elias and Mr. Tom go into the woods that evening, carrying something wrapped in cloth. They told me not to tell, said it was hunting business. But it was still light out, too early for hunting." "Girl, you shut your mouth," Elias hissed, taking a step toward her. Sarah's mother, a worn woman with rough hands from laundry work, pulled her daughter back, but didn't silence her. Something had shifted in the woman's face, doubt creeping in where certainty had been. "Mariah taught me to read," Sarah continued, her voice growing stronger. "She gave me her mother's Bible when I told her we couldn't afford one. She ain't no witch. She's kind. She's good." "The child's been deceived by devilry," Reverend Michaels started, but his words lacked their earlier conviction. Then something else happened. Something nobody expected. Mariah's old mule, a stubborn beast named Jonah that she'd had since before she married, came trotting into the square. The animal had been tied up at the livery, but somehow it had gotten loose. It walked straight through the crowd, ignoring every attempt to catch it, and stopped directly beneath the platform where Mariah stood with a noose around her neck. The mule looked up at her and brayed. a long, mournful sound that carried across the entire square. Then it sat down, planted its hindquarters right there in the dust, and refused to move. In any other moment, it might have been comical. But there was something in that stubborn animal's refusal, in its simple loyalty, that struck deeper than any speech could. The crowd began to murmur, not in anger now, but in uncertainty. Animals knew things, the old wisdom said. Animals could sense evil. And this animal had chosen to sit beneath a woman they called a witch, offering its silent testimony. Martha Healy stepped forward then, her weathered face set in new determination. I've known Mariah since she came to this town as James's bride. She nursed my son through scarlet fever, sat up 3 nights without sleep. She never asked for nothing in return. She turned to face Crane directly. If she's a witch, then I'm the devil's sister, and you can hang me too. Another voice joined hers, old Samuel Birch, who'd fought in the Mexican War, and whose words still carried weight. I seen enough innocent folk killed for politics and land grabs. Smells the same here. The platform creaked as Caleb climbed the steps. Nobody stopped him. He moved behind Mariah and drew his knife. The crowd tensed, but he only cut the rope binding her wrists. The hemp fell away, showing raw, bleeding skin beneath. Then he lifted the noose from her neck, gentle as handling a newborn. Finally, he removed the wooden sign, the word witch staring up at him in crude black letters. Caleb carried the wooden sign to the edge of the platform, where a barrel fire burned for the blacksmith's work. He held it up so every person in that square could see it. The ugly words, the hasty judgment, the weight of shame they'd tried to hang around an innocent woman's neck. Then, without ceremony, he fed it to the flames. The wood caught quick, the paint blistering and blackening. The letters curled into ash and smoke, rising up toward a sky that had witnessed too many wrongs and offered no answers. Nobody moved to stop him. Even Crane seemed frozen, his authority evaporating like morning dew under the scorching truth of daylight. Elias made one last attempt, his hand going to his gun. You're interfering with justice. There ain't no justice here, Caleb said, his hand already on his own knife. Just greed wearing a righteous mask. You want her land. We all know it. Question is whether this town's going to let you kill a pregnant woman to get it. The 2 men stared at each other across the dusty square. For a moment, violence hung in the air like the smell before lightning strikes. But Elias saw something in Caleb's eyes, the look of a man who'd already lost everything that mattered and had nothing left to fear, and his hand fell away from his weapon. This ain't over, Elias spat, but he was already backing toward his horse. You'll regret this interference, stranger. I regret plenty, Caleb said quietly. This won't be on the list. Elias rode out in a cloud of dust and impotent rage. The crowd began to disperse, some quickly as if ashamed, others slowly, still uncertain. Only Sarah Potts and her mother approached the platform. The mother carried a canteen of water, which Mariah drank from with shaking hands. Sarah just stood close, her small presence a comfort beyond words. That night, Caleb helped Mariah back to her cabin. She could barely walk, her body finally acknowledging the trauma it had endured. He carried her the last 100 yards, feeling the weight of her and the child both, feeling the terrible fragility of life in his arms. It reminded him too much of carrying his daughter's body, but this time the woman was breathing, heart still beating against his chest. He laid her on the bed James had built, covered her with quilts that still smelled faintly of the dead man's tobacco. She was asleep before he reached the door. Caleb stayed. He told himself it was just for the night, just to make sure Elias didn't come back with violence on his mind. But the night turned into a week, and the week into a month. He slept in the barn, fixed the fence that had started to lean, chopped enough wood to see her through winter. They didn't speak much. Words felt unnecessary after what they'd survived together. Mariah healed slowly. The rope burns on her wrists scabbed over, then scarred. Thin white lines she'd carry forever. She didn't try to hide them. Some mornings, Caleb would find her standing at the window, one hand on her belly, the other tracing those scars like reading Braille, remembering. 3 months later, when the first snow began to fall, Mariah's water broke. Caleb rode hard for the midwife, brought her back through the storm. He waited outside in the cold, listening to Mariah's screams, hearing echoes of his daughter's voice in every cry. When the baby finally came, a girl with a shock of dark hair and lungs that could wake the dead, the midwife brought her out wrapped in cloth. "She wants you to see," the midwife said, handing the baby to Caleb. He held his granddaughter that never was, his daughter that couldn't be, this child that somehow was both, and neither. The baby's tiny fist wrapped around his calloused finger, and something in his chest that had been frozen since Shiloh began, finally, to thaw. Mariah named her Hope, not for sentiment, but for defiance, for the stubborn insistence that life continues, that goodness survives, even when the world tries its damnedest to snuff it out. Caleb stayed through winter. Come spring, he built a cairn of stones at the edge of Mariah's property, marking the place where her old life had ended and something new had begun. On the largest stone, he carved a single word with his knife: survived, not forgiven, not justified, not triumphant, just survived, which was its own kind of victory. Some nights, sitting by the fire with Hope sleeping in her mother's arms, Caleb would catch Mariah staring at her wrist scars. He understood. Some wounds marked you permanent, changed the shape of who you were. You didn't forget them. You didn't pretend they never happened. You just learned to carry them. Let them become part of the story written on your skin. Years later, travelers passing through would hear about the widow woman with the rope scars and the child they'd tried to kill before she was born. They'd hear about the ex-soldier who'd stopped a hanging with nothing but his word and his willingness to stand in the gap. The story would grow in the telling, become legend, become the kind of tale people told around campfires when they needed reminding that sometimes, just sometimes, one voice speaking truth could shift the world. But the truth was simpler and harder than legend. The truth was that Mariah still flinched at sudden noises, still woke gasping from dreams of the noose. The truth was that Caleb still carried ghosts he'd never fully bury. The truth was that the scars stayed, the memory stayed, and justice, real justice, never quite came. What came instead was morning, another day, the sound of a child laughing, the smell of bread baking, the simple, defiant act of continuing to breathe, to plant seeds, to believe that survival itself was a kind of resistance. On quiet evenings, when the work was done and Hope was asleep, Mariah would sometimes ask Caleb why he'd stopped, why he'd risked himself for a stranger in a town that meant nothing to him. He never had a good answer. The best he could offer was this: I'd seen enough people die for lies. Figured it was time to see if truth could save someone for once. It wasn't poetry. It wasn't even particularly hopeful, but it was honest. And honesty was the only currency worth keeping in a world that traded so freely in deception. The cairn of stones still stands at the edge of that property, weathered by wind and rain, but enduring. The word carved there has grown faint, but remains readable. Survived. It asks a question of everyone who sees it, though the question is never spoken aloud. When the rope is around the neck of the innocent, when the crowd is baying for blood, when injustice wears the mask of righteousness, will you be the one who stands? Will you speak when silence is safer? Will you choose the harder right over the easier wrong? Or will you be the one who looks away, who tells yourself it isn't your business, who lets another body drop because getting involved might cost you something precious? The stones don't answer. They just stand there, silent witnesses, marking the place where one woman refused to die and one man refused to let her. And in that refusal, in that stubborn insistence on mercy over judgment, on truth over convenience, on life over death, that's where the real story lives. Not in triumph, not in vindication, but in the quiet, unglamorous work of survival, in the scars that don't fade, in the mourning that comes anyway, in the simple fact that the rope burned but didn't break her. If this story stirred something in you, if you felt the dust on your boots and the rope burn on your wrists, then subscribe to keep the campfire burning. More tales of defiance, survival, and the Wild West await. Don't let the story end here. Hit that subscribe button and ride with us into the next legend.